there's 22 people in the kitchen that were all full-time. Out of those 22 people, we only had 4 people that qualified for JobKeeper. Ironically, the whole kitchen team, inclusive of the ones that weren't qualifying for any sort of financial support from the government, every single one of them donated their time to cook for homeless people. And I just thought that was pretty amazing.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. One thing the pandemic has shown is how adaptable we are. It's also shown how, in the face of adversity, that empathy lives and breathes in human nature. And in most instances, we have each other's backs, no matter how messy it gets. During the pandemic, we've seen hospitality workers do extraordinary things and take extraordinary chances too. Adam Liston is the head chef of Adelaide's Shobosho and new restaurant ShoSho. Adam, how are you going?
Good, mate. How are you?
Good. You've had, like many, a bit of a wild ride in the last couple of months and done many things, including just at the moment opening a new restaurant during a pandemic. What are you thinking?
Yeah, a lot of people think I'm pretty crazy, but I think at the end of the day, we were sort of forced into a position where we have to reopen this site. I'm currently at ShoSho now. We didn't really have a choice other than to redevelop it and turn it into something that we can make work.
Well, it was Joybird, wasn't it, originally? And I guess that kind of closed a couple of months ago, and you reinvigorated the space. Is it inspired by Shobosho at all? Is there synergies there?
There is, and like in fairness to the COVID kind of conversation, I mean, Joybird wasn't affected by COVID at all. We actually made the decision to close that restaurant pre-COVID kicking in, and that was just for the reasons being that the restaurant wasn't performing, and it was always a vision moving forward because the lease is so long here that we had to do something to reinvent. And that ShoSho sort of concept was something that we'd been talking about leading up to it. But yeah, there is definitely a good correlation between the two restaurants, but they're completely different, especially now that we've seen the site grow and the menu's been executed and we're only a week away from opening. I mean, we did a first function last night. So yeah, now that I can see the space and cook in the space, yeah, it's definitely a correlation, but it's they're not the same restaurant at all.
Well, we can get into that a little bit later. Do you want to take us back early on when the lockdown happened? I remember on Instagram you put a video up, and it was, you were sort of hard on your sleeve sort of stuff, and it was sort of a call out to get chefs like yourself involved to help feed people. Can you take us back to that time and what it was like?
Yeah, look, to be honest, I was in a situation leading up to this stuff where my role in the businesses had changed a little bit, and I was working pretty closely with my business partner, who's the probably bigger boss of a number of different restaurants, and some of those restaurants I'm involved in and some I'm not. And we were in a spot at that point where, in particular, me and him were really working on like business development, and this COVID stuff came on board, and I think, yeah, I just got a little bit kind of sketchy with what was going on, like most chefs and restaurateurs and front of house people that are around the country and around the world. All we kept hearing was that there was going to be this big demand for, people that weren't being able to cook food for people in hospitals or nursing homes, and I was probably just a little bit scared of having nothing to do, and I kept hearing all this stuff about there was going to be a big need for that, so we kind of went out with a social media post and sort of offered some help, because at that time we were completely unsure of what the government was going to do. There was no JobKeeper, no job seeker, none of that stuff was around, and we were just trying to use our kind of skills to help. And that went through a really pretty heavy road. There was a lot of stuff that went on there that was pretty good. There was a lot of rewarding things, and there was a lot of things that opened up my eyes, and opened up my business partner's eyes that we were very disappointed in. But yeah, it was a pretty full-on time, like it was for most people.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you got involved in there? Because I know that you were helping homeless people and you were trying to create meals for those on the front line working, and you're also trying to help workers on international visas who had no income and no jobs.
Yeah, it was pretty layered, and we didn't go into that really knowing what we were going to be able to offer. And through that kind of social media post and that video, we got a lot of people coming and messaging and emailing, sort of trying to access the stuff that we were potentially going to offer. And at the time, I probably thought we were going to target hospitals and nursing homes. And the thing that we quickly realised that there's a lot of red tape when it comes to working for hospitals and nursing homes. So there's like police checks, there's like obviously skill sets that you need that a lot of chefs don't have, and I'm one of those people that don't have them. I mean, I don't cook. I'm not experiencing cooking food for people that are unwell. Like I don't know the nutrient level that people need. I don't have the skill set. So we quickly realised that we were, one, not skilled at potentially offering that service, and then two, the red tape that was involved in it was pretty full on. And not to say that I wouldn't pass a police check, because I think I would, but yeah, it actually just became something that was pretty fucking frustrating. So what ended up happening was a company in South Australia, which is called Westcare, which is a private company. It's not a government company. They were in a position where they were cooking for, and have been for, 20, 30 years, cooking for homeless people of Adelaide. But those volunteers that were traditionally cooking for those people were in that age bracket of that 60 to 70 mark, which is the danger zone. So those volunteers were put in a position where they didn't want to put themselves at risk. And then these guys contacted me, and ironically, there was this loophole in the system where we could actually cook the food for these homeless people from the Shobosho kitchen. So they would drop off the food to us, we would process that food, then they would pick it up. So in a lot of ways, it actually ticked all the boxes, because we weren't throwing our staff into harm's way. We weren't going into populated environments. We were in a controlled kitchen, which is the kitchen that we obviously have at Shobosho. And the recipe just seemed to work really well. So that we did that for ages. We did it. We were serving 900 people per week.
Wow. What sort of food were you cooking?
To be honest, like, we didn't really know, and that was one of the exciting things from it. Like, you don't, as a chef, when you're ordering food at night time, you know what it is that you're going to get the next day to process that product. The thing that was kind of cool about this situation is it was all donated product. So a lot of that was vegetables, and there was some specific kind of need from, obviously a lot of these homeless people, were diabetic. So we had to kind of steer away from cooking with sugars and cooking with high fat levels. But we were predominantly just working with vegetables that were being donated. And I think that the best thing that came from that was we're in a position where I normally would entirely write the menu for Shobosho, but the team that were, volunteering their time, they were in a position where they could be creative. So, the sort of food that we would cook, we'd just sort of make it up on the day. It was a pretty good, like, kind of team bonding experience to be creative in a time when most people were pretty fucking bored.
What was it like cooking for homeless people? You're normally having guests come in and spend, sometimes quite substantial amount of money in your restaurant. Did that change your view on things?
Not really. I actually kind of found the process pretty liberating, and I one of the biggest things that I took from it, which is a double-edged sword, that the problem at Shobosho at that time was there's 22 people in the kitchen that were all full-time. Out of those 22 people, we only had 4 people that qualified for JobKeeper, and that was due to their visas. And ironically, the whole kitchen team, inclusive of the ones that weren't qualifying for any sort of financial support from the government, every single one of them donated their time to cook for homeless people. And I just thought that was pretty amazing. So didn't really change my view on food. It just made me think, wow, it's pretty amazing that these people are prepared to do that, and we did it for a fair chunk. Like we didn't really have anyone that like pulled out at all. Not one of them did, and it was pretty awesome just to see how many people like donated that time.
You also started Dr. Show. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean that was the other bit that happened through that social media post. There was a lot of different kind of organisations that had contacted us, and one of the popular ones was actually doctors and nurses. There was a bunch of messages from people that were working in hospitals here that were working overtime, and the cafeterias in those hospitals were being closed down through to COVID. So they were in a position where they were doing overtime and going home. And I think the biggest thing that stood out to me was that there was a nurse that reached out and said that she was going home after doing a 13, 14-hour shift and eating a toasted sandwich. And I was like, that's what fucking chefs do. Like we always do that sort of stuff. And she said, look, we're not in a position where we need a donation from you guys. We want to actually get good nourishment, and we want to eat food that, you know, this kind of Shobosho-esque food. Can we sort of pre-order it and go through that? So we did that for a while, and it was really good. I mean, yeah, we had a sort of pickup service for anyone that wanted to. We also had a delivery option for that. It was really good. It was good to sort of cook the food that we do at Shobosho, but look at it from a different perspective. It wasn't like coming to the restaurant and indulging in a night. It was more about, okay, we're cooking this food because these people actually need nourishment. It was liberating.
Did that change your approach in the kitchen, and did it change dishes, the way that you put them together?
Yeah, I mean, look, like a lot of other restaurants around the country, like we went into that sort of takeaway mode, and then obviously that service was a takeaway mode, and we did that in layers. We tried to offer a service that would be reheated, and then there was another service of that menu where we'd give cooking instructions. And I think I've watched a lot of restaurants around the country do that. From my side, like it was good, but it's definitely not a skill set that I've got. It's not something that I really want to revisit again. I'd sort of rather cook in a restaurant. And it was a little bit disheartening as well, especially when you're talking about Asian food. You know, and I'll use two examples. One being, you know, Japanese style raw fish. You know, that doesn't really travel well. You sort of got to be at a point where it's at the right temperature. And then another one is, you know, like the dumplings and stuff from a Chinese level that we make at Shobosho. They're based on, you know, being handmade with good ingredients and served at the right temperature. All of a sudden, you know, we're throwing 6 wontons into a takeaway container, and they're, you know, being eaten at lukewarm temperature. It was pretty shit. But yeah, it's not something I want to revisit.
How did you get into the industry? Like, why did you become a chef?
I never really wanted to. Like, to be honest, as a younger guy, I was a surfer. So I finished high school and I got into university, and I deferred it for a year because I wanted to keep surfing. And ironically, you know, to make money, then surf during the day, I'd just cook or wash dishes at night time. So I did that for a couple of years. And then eventually I moved from Adelaide to New South Wales for the reason of surfing, and, you know, just sort of had that sort of mentality of let's just surf during the day and cook and make money. And I did that for a couple of years, and eventually I started working with people that were pretty inspiring, and I realised that, you know, that was something that I really wanted to do. So outside of that, I mean, my mother's a really good cook. Both my grandmothers were awesome cooks. But no, there's no beautiful story about why I wanted to be a chef at all.
You mentioned briefly, though, that there was a couple of key inspirational people that you worked with. What were some of the key moments in your career that set you on different paths and influences?
One person that I did work for that I learned a lot from was Ray Capaldi. He was pretty inspirational. So he's probably the biggest note. But outside of that, most of my stuff was kind of done through travel. Like I spent a lot of time and worked in Shanghai and China, so I really got a lot of absorbing information of being in that scenario, which was really good. But then also working with the business partners that I've got now, the guy that I'm in partnership with that at the moment, was the first guy that employed me as a head chef here in Adelaide, and he's been a friend of mine for 25 years.
How would you explain the food that you're doing at Shobosho and also ShoSho at the moment?
Shobosho has always been, because it sits on Lee Street in Adelaide, which is a semi-party street, and it kind of verges on the end of a street called Hindley Street, which is everyone kind of uses it equivalent to the King's Cross of Sydney. And that street's pretty full on. There's a lot of like mixed characters that run up and down that. Then Lee Street kind of feeds off of that, and Shobosho sits in the middle of that street. So it's more of it's an aggressive kind of fire cooking, punchy, loud party izakaya. So the food, verges between cooking Japanese, Korean, Chinese. There's no Southeast Asian like kind of touches to any of that stuff. And it breaks a lot of rules. There's nothing traditional about anything that happens at Shobosho. But then, moving over to ShoSho's a little bit more of it's a bigger restaurant for the start, and it's a little bit more luxurious, and there's a lot more of a focus on tempura, so there's a little bit more tradition to it, a little bit more finesse at ShoSho from what I can see so far.
Izakayas in Japan are very much, like dining dens and elbow-to-elbow drinking houses with restrictions currently in place. How do you think that'll manifest with the restaurant at the moment?
Look, at the risk of not wanting to come across as lucky me, the Adelaide dining scene, from what I can see and from the information that's been given to me from my major business partner who's got other restaurants, I've been quite surprised with those restrictions being lifted. I always had a theory that we discussed pretty heavily with our partners, that we knew once the restrictions were lifted that we'd get a real big influx of clientele. And that's obviously because people have been held captive. But now in South Australia, because we've been in that situation for a couple of months now, it's actually a little bit surprising to see that the restaurant trade seems to be pretty stable. So ShoSho is not really technically open yet. We've only gone through some trial openings, but Shobosho, has actually seen a really good steady growth of people coming out of this pandemic. So yeah, we're lucky on that front, and the information I get from other chefs and restaurateurs in the state, it sounds like business is sort of getting more stable, and it's not looking like it's going to shut down unless we obviously go through the unfortunate situation that Victoria is going through right now.
How do you feel about that at the moment? Seeing that they're in a lockdown, and it's with the potential that it could happen in any city here. Are you nervous about the future, or do you think it's going to be okay in Adelaide?
Definitely nervous, and I speak to a lot of guys in Melbourne that are close friends of mine that are chefs and run their restaurants, and I spent a couple of years living in Melbourne and cooking there, and it's really sad to hear the things that are going on, and also watching like the stuff on social media. I can't imagine how it would be for Melbourne right now. They've just reopened and they've sort of started to get their groove back, and then all of a sudden, it's all shut down for, lockdown for 6 weeks. That must be so heartbreaking. And then, obviously listening to some of your podcasts and listening to the people that you've interviewed and the pain that they've gone through, I can't imagine how that would feel. In terms of South Australia, I think, I don't know. I'm not sure that we're hopefully not going to go through this pandemic again. And it seems like we've got something under control, and it seems like, we're not getting new cases every day. But, it's a concern, but at the moment I'm pretty confident that we'll be okay.
With ShoSho about to open, how are you feeling about it? You've opened new restaurants before, but it hasn't been breaking out of a pandemic. Does it feel different?
It does, and I was thinking about this before I got on the phone to you. I guess the thing about ShoSho is, it was disappointing that we sort of had the unfortunate situation of Joybird. But at the same time, I think one of the positives that's come through this pandemic for us looking at ShoSho is that it's given us a lot of time to think. It's given us a lot of time to plan and execute the way that the restaurant looks. The menu's been tested more times than I probably ever had the chance to at Shobosho. And also the fact that because of the JobKeeper stuff and the good relationships that we've got with the landlord and obviously the suppliers, we're actually in a position at ShoSho where the restaurant seats 90 people, but we've gone into it saying that we're only going to do services where we do 20 people in a sitting. So that luxury comes from the support of JobKeeper and obviously our suppliers and landlord. And that gives me a little bit of confidence going, okay, well, we're going to get this product right before we increase the capacity of what we're going to serve. So, and on top of that, ironically, the restaurant, we launched the fact that you could book in it, I think last week, and we've got a steady influx of bookings now for the next 3 weeks. So I feel good about that. And that's, I'm just trying to turn something that was negative into a positive, and that's one of the positives that I see for ShoSho.
You just mentioned that you've spent the most time you've ever had on a menu leading up to opening a restaurant. What's some of the dishes that you've created that you're quite excited about?
I never really wanted to do tempura because I'm someone I travel to Japan prior to the pandemic. I normally average twice a year sort of trip, and it's pretty heavy eating. And I know the level of detail that goes into tempura, but my business partner was pretty passionate about it. So I really enjoyed taking that challenge on. So what we're trying to do with that is a sort of similar Shobosho-esque view of respecting where that kind of cuisine comes from, but also making sure that we bring our own kind of energy to it. So one of the probably most exciting dish that we've got on that we tested last night was a crab head that we get from the guys at Two Golf's Crab, and that's a blue swimmer crab head. We layer obviously the head's been cleaned out. We cook a tapioca in crab stock from the shells, layer that in the bottom, and then we steam the hand-picked meat. And then we've got a recipe from a Singaporean place that does this white pepper sauce. We layer the crab with that white pepper sauce, and then we just cover the sauce with tempura batter. So it's like a 3-layer kind of crunchy, gooey, steamy, peppery, not very tempura, kind of breaking the rules. That sort of stuff. I'm excited about that.
How do you think the lack of travel or international travel is going to affect food in this country? You mentioned earlier about how you travel to Japan a couple times a year, and also a lot of your training was to do with traveling. What sort of impact do you think that'll have ongoing?
I think from a business perspective, it's probably pretty positive that people in the state are going to constantly support the restaurants and bars and stuff that are in the state. And I don't want to sound rude to any South Australian restaurants, but generally what I would do would save my money I'd eat out, and obviously my favourite places here, but pre this pandemic, my goal was always to kind of save my money and go to Japan or Hong Kong and eat there. So that's disappointing from a personal level, but from a positive perspective, I feel that it's really brought the community back together. And there's, especially in South Australia, and I obviously can't speak for the other states, we haven't have the ability to go there, but the level of support from the community has been amazing, and the amount of people that have really wanted to come back out and support restaurants has been pretty awesome. So I don't know. At the moment, it's a double-edged sword. I think it's a positive to some degree, but at the same time, it's obviously personally disappointing that we can't get on a plane and go and eat something completely different.
A little earlier, you were sort of saying about how traveling was a big part of your training. How did you end up overseas? What was the process of getting those sort of gigs?
I was just lucky enough to be in a situation where I was working in Melbourne after moving from South Australia to Melbourne, and I had a contact with a lady that had some connections in Shanghai, and she kind of reached out to me and said, do you want to have a look at this position? So I didn't really know if I was capable of doing it, and sort of went through that process, and then there was a few emails, and eventually this owner of the restaurant said, look, we're going to fly over and get you to cook for us. And I did that on my own, and I sort of came back. They'd offered me the position, and I spoke to my partner at the time about whether or not we were going to make that commitment, and we decided that we would. And that just completely changed everything, like, for me as a chef, because being immersed in that culture was, one, pretty challenging from a perspective of communication. I don't speak Chinese at all. And to run a kitchen, which was, that particular kitchen was like 27 chefs that, only 2 of them spoke English. It really just kind of shaped the way that I learned how to communicate with people through actually doing movement instead of actually talking. So, and on top of that, like, being in that situation, also living in an environment where you were subjected to, all that beautiful food that Chinese people cook. And then being in China and having the ability to go to places like, Japan pretty easily. It's only an hour and a half flight to Tokyo from Shanghai. I mean, that was just an easy thing for me to constantly do. So that was probably the biggest thing from my side that shaped what I cook now. Just the ability to be involved in different culture.
You mentioned earlier about the majority of your team not having government assistance, but they turned up to volunteer and help cook for homeless people. Have you managed to hold on to many of those staff after reopening and also on the verge of opening the new restaurant?
Yeah, ironically, we didn't lose one staff member, and that's a credit to them because, a lot of the guys and girls in the kitchen, obviously they were donating time for the homeless, but they also went out and got positions working, at Woolworths and Coles, stocking shelves. And that was really sad because every restaurateur, I've heard this on a few of your interviews that you've done on this podcast, the worst thing about being a restaurateur in that situation was that we're used to protecting people and looking after people. And financially, we just weren't in a position to be able to just pay people at all. And big credit to the team at Shobosho that they went through that process. They never got upset with us, and we did our best to try and do the things that we could within our own limitations. But no, we got every one of them back, and they're all full-time again now. And then, ironically, I thought it was going to be really hard to find staff for the new place, being ShoSho. And it wasn't. Like, the team at ShoSho is really, really strong. I haven't worked with half of them before, but the quality of resumes and the quality of skill that we've kind of put these guys through is pretty much a standout. Like, we're in a good spot in both shops.
Well, that's pretty astounding that you've managed to hold on to the entire team, and you are on the verge of opening the restaurant. What are you excited about?
I really like the fact that the 2 restaurants, they're never going to be a favourite. I mean, they're both obviously close to my heart, and Shobosho obviously is the older one, and that's the one that kind of, like, from my side was the one that really kind of sparked what we're doing in Adelaide and made me probably the most inspired I've ever been. I just like the correlation between the 2. I think they're completely different places, and I think that the good thing that ShoSho's got, it sits in a very affluent suburb of Adelaide, and it's a bigger restaurant with the ability and luxury of the fact that we've had 3.5 years now at Shobosho working on our brand. ShoSho is going to benefit from that because of all the work that's gone into it, and it's also going to benefit from the mistakes that we made at Shobosho that we've learnt from. Obviously, there'll be more mistakes that we make at ShoSho. It's a brand new shop, but it's pretty good to be in a position where that style of food in both restaurants is something that I feel super comfortable with, and my business partners feel comfortable with as well. So just excited about the fact that we're going to do something different and going to make this restaurant a part of the family of Shobosho.
Well, as you know, I had a cracking feed at Shobosho, and they sat me down directly in front of you at the kitchen counter.
Yeah, scariest fucking dude I've ever cooked for, man. Fucking hell, man.
Well, I had a great meal, and that was great. And Terry and Jill were like 2 seats down as well. It must have been a hell of an evening.
Yeah, it was a really good time, man. I was stoked.
Well, listen, have a great time opening the new restaurant, and good luck with it. And hopefully, it's as cracking as the meal I had at Shobosho about 2 years ago. And thanks for joining us, mate. We're always great to chat.
Thank you, mate. Cheers.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we share the stories of Australia's hospo community, suppliers and producers in search of hope during this pandemic. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.